Okay, so today we're going to go ahead and get started on our next section titled The Home Front During World War II. And we know that World War II, just like World War I, is what was considered a total war. Total war. And what that means is that, historically speaking, especially when we look back further and further in time, armies would fight outside of the city, and whoever won would control the city. There wasn't really involvement. Soldiers fought outside of the cities, oftentimes in the walled cities, um, between kings and lords and all those types. And the people in the city just kind of followed whoever took them over. Um, Starting in World War I, that was not true. Countries started attacking each other's cities so as to disrupt the economic and the the factories, industrial capabilities of the opposing armies. And we're going to find out that World War II was much, much more of a total war than World War I, where every aspect of the city, of the country was being attacked, and where civilians all tried to do their part in the war effort. We're going to see that many cities were destroyed, up to 20,000 civilians died. And almost all companies and factories were turned into factories that made stuff during the war. Here I have a chart that we'll take a look at later as well. But this is the death count. Boy, that looks weird, the way it's see-through. Of countries during World War II. Maybe if I move this to the side, it'll look a little better. Come on, give me space here. This isn't working well for me. I'm having a hard time. So look, the Soviet Union lost the most people. We can see China actually losing a whole heck of a lot of people, especially civilian deaths, because the red are military deaths, the orange are civilian deaths. In the Soviet Union, it was about even between civilians killed and non-civilians killed. You guys, that's 24 million Soviets or Russians that were killed. China lost, what is that, close to 20 million. And Poland lost a bunch. Look how small the military deaths were in Poland compared to the civilian deaths. You guys, that's Holocaust right there. Indonesia, the same, which you might find, not Germany, right? And not Japan. Gosh, the US deaths, so small, no civilian deaths in our country. So look how few deaths the US and the UK have compared to these other countries. That really, it was about, I don't know, equal during the war between civilian deaths and military deaths. And for a large part, it's because of this concept of total war. And you can see here an image of a factory making planes. And that's why they were bombing the cities, so they wouldn't be able to make planes, so they wouldn't have the money to buy the planes. All right, the Soviet Union was hit the hardest. And really, one of the crazy stories, I think, of World War II is of what was called Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. You can see that the green here would be the Finnish and the Germans attacking the Russian city of Leningrad. They cut it off from the rest of the Soviet Union. They could not bring in supplies. And for 900 straight days, okay, that's like almost 3 years, the city was under attack, but they never gave up. How tough do you have to be to withstand 3 years of attacks and not give up? 1.5 million civilians died. They ate cats, dogs, rats, whatever it took to survive, but they weren't giving up. The Russians, so tough in this war. Factories were all moved to the middle of the Soviet Union, so they couldn't be taken over. How do you move a factory? I didn't even know they could do that. And 55% of all Soviet income went to war materials. That means they weren't spending money on food or on the people. People in the country suffered food and housing shortages. Women in the Soviet Union not only worked making war materials, but they also they also fought in the war. The Soviet Union was the only country that had women who fought in the war. I have a personal connection here. My mother-in-law um, well, was alive. She was a young child during World War II. And there's a horrifying story that I'm going to share to you guys about this. One day, her mother, when she was like 6 or 5 or in this range, went to pick up their daily ration of food. It was soup. And someone tried to steal the soup from her. And she fought back. This person knocked her to the ground or hit her or something like that. Most of the soup spilled, from what I hear, and she died. My mother-in-law lost her mother when she was 6 during World War II, fighting to bring the soup home to the family. Starvation, right? Suffering of the people on the home front was horrible in the Soviet Union, but boy, did they stand tough. Speaking of the fact that the women were fighting in war, this woman, Ludmila Papachenko, is known as the greatest female sniper. I think she sniped like hundreds of Germans. She was competing with German snipers. It's not like you can tell if a sniper is a man or a woman while they're fighting you. And she was a great shot, I guess. She killed many Germans. Women in Russia fought in war. Talk about the home front being affected. These people were actually fighting. In the United States, there was no fighting. I mentioned, though, that there was one rogue submarine that attacked Santa Barbara and in a military base in Oregon, but no one died. But boy, were we lucky about that. Except for Pearl Harbor, which was not part of the United States at the point. It was just a territory. So those deaths don't count, which is weird. They're American citizens. I don't understand why. What do I know? The U.S. not only, once we started getting our factories running, made weapons for our army, but for all of the Allied forces, for the British, for the Australians, and the New Zealanders, and the Chinese, and anyone who needed weapons, we made them. I thought saw somewhere that it was like 6 ships a day and like 9,000 planes a year. There was 90,000 planes a year. I got to double check on that. It was 96,000 planes a year, almost 100,000 planes a year. I'm not that great at math, but man, that's thousands a day, isn't it? Quick math tells me if that's almost 100,000, maybe is that 10,000 planes a day? No, 1,000 planes a day or something. 3,000. Oh my gosh, so many. Our factories were just kicking them out. And that's really, the winner of this war was the person who could make more weapons quick enough, often. And that was our side. That was what we were great about, largely because we weren't being attacked. Almost all industries converted to war making stuff. So if you had a pipe company for plumbing, you now made gun barrels. If you had a clothing company for Laker jerseys, which didn't exist back then, you now made military outfits. If you had a Jeep, if you had a car factory, you made Jeeps and tanks and planes and all of it. Every factory turned into a war materials factory. Also, we learned that many African Americans from the South moved to the cities in the Northeast, where the factories were. So in our country, we kind of know that on the East Coast, in the North, is where the factories and industry were, and in the South is where the farms were. In the South is where slavery was. In the North is where the businesses were. And both during World War I, and this period in World War I begins the Great Migration, and then in World War II, many African Americans moved to the North for jobs because the factories were looking for people to work. And in the South, there wasn't as much farming going on. So they moved up north. This actually, sadly, goes to show you the way things were back then. Caused race riots caused by white people who were mad that the African Americans were moving to the Northeast. So what cities are in the Northeast? Which industrial hubs are we talking about? Well, some of these race riots were in Detroit, where all the cars were being made, and all the factories, Cleveland, Chicago, New York, you know, your Cleveland and Milwaukee, Philly, right? All of these great big northeastern cities that had a lot of industrial factories and stuff saw a huge migration. You know, when we talk about the demographics of our country and the way races are kind of spread out, um, you know, historically, a lot of African Americans lived in the South where slavery existed, and very few lived in the Northeast. But this was the moment when there was that huge shift, right? And tens of millions of African Americans moved to these cities. And still to this day, these cities in the Northeast have large African American populations. I mean, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but this was when that migration happened, right? And then also another horrific moment in our country's history. Not only do we have race riots, well, African Americans moving up to help us win the war against Hitler. We're so mad about that. We don't care about Hitler. Let's riot against this. Right? But then also 10,000 Japanese Americans were uprooted from their houses. What that means is the government took their house and took all their belongings. Okay, so I worked really hard in my life to afford a house, right? I bought things, refrigerators, couches, TVs, whatever I have in my house, right? And all of a sudden they show up on the West Coast. This only happened in the West Coast. The Japanese population was much stronger and heavier on the West Coast. And they say, you have to go live in these cities in the middle of the desert. And here is a map of all these cities, okay? You can see all these little dots here, right? And you have to now give up your life, your house and everything. We're not going to pay you for it. These were assembly centers. The triangles were the relocation centers, not the dots, but the triangles on this map. There's one right there. And you have to live in the middle of the desert during the war because we're afraid that you're going to be a spy for the Japanese. Is there a word for that? You take everyone up and you take all their stuff and you put them into camps in the middle of the desert or in the middle of nowhere because we're afraid to be spies. I think there's a few words that we could think of that kind of meet that criteria. Embarrassing, probably the most important one. These were relocation camps, and the Japanese Americans lost everything and were forced to go into camp. They were treated poorly. Well, there wasn't a lot of deaths in these camps. It wasn't like, you know, or work camps, none of that, you know, like the Russian or the German camps. But still, someone told me I had to move all my stuff and go live in a camp just because of my race, lose everything I ever worked for my entire life. That's just beyond awful, right? You know, and it's interesting because we have some of these camps in California. If you ever, right, when I was a younger kid, I used to like to snowboard. If you ever take the old 5 to the 14 to the 395 in Mojave and you take that up to Mammoth, which has some of the best snowboarding in the world, that snow up there, and especially before it got all corporate, it wasn't as expensive as it is now. It's like crazy. But that place is one of the best places to ride in the world. You'll, between Lone Pine and Independence on the left side of the 395 is Manzanar. This is it. This is what it looked like. They would force people to live in the middle of the desert, and cold desert, and stay there during the war because they were Japanese. So that's America's experience during World War II. Total War, I also mentioned at one point that my neighbor growing up was a guy named Buzz Fortin, who, by the way, fought in this war, but before he was drafted and forced to go across because he was still young, he used to say, do you see that house down there? 1, 2, 3 over across the street, 3 up, 1 across the street. He was my next door neighbor growing up. He's a good guy. He goes, they used to sell rabbits during the first half of the war. They would breed rabbits in the backyard. They had hundreds of cages. And rabbits breed quickly. And people would line up to buy their rabbits there to eat because there wasn't any meat, because all of the meat was going to the men. And this wasn't just in America. This was all the good food went to the soldiers. And the people all kind of found a way to get by, but didn't eat as well as they were used to, that's for sure. So this is total war. This is what it means, right? To have lived during World War II. Everyone was part of this war effort. And some people in our country were treated awfully. Let's leave it there. In Germany, most Germans were not excited, like they had been before the war. They were scared, understandably, because Germany had lost World War I. So Hitler didn't do anything at first. He built his army. He put his Autobahn, his freeways. He's the inventor of kind of the inventor of the modern freeways, but it would all run around the outskirts of the city. Nothing went through the city like our 101. So no one would see the weapons of war as they were being moved around in the middle of the night. He would move all the weapons on this Autobahn. That's the whole original point. He didn't want Germans to know that this was that this was happening until 1942, when they finally started to speed up materials. But for a long time, he sheltered the Germans, and he keep sending messages to Germany like, "We're winning, we're winning, we're winning." Even when they started to lose, it was still like, "We're winning, we're winning, we're winning." By 1944, though, the entire economy shut down except for wartime industries. But the German women still weren't asked to work. American women were. Right? American women didn't fight, but American women were known to be part of the war effort. They made weapons of war, just like during World War I. They were incredibly important in arming the Allies. The German women, though, were still kind of told, "Hey, just have babies. That's your job," right? And then last thing we're going to talk about here are the Japanese. And Japan wasn't a liberal democracy before World War II. They didn't have the kind of expectations of like freedom that we do and like the Europeans did, thanks to the Enlightenment and all the stuff we've studied. So they just said, you guys have to sacrifice. And all Japanese were kind of raised to believe that, being willing to sacrifice for their country. The whole country was just engulfed and dedicated to this war in a way that we didn't see in little Western countries. And so far that towards the end of the war, the Japanese men were asked to volunteer to become suicide bombers. Volunteer. Suicide bombers, to fly their planes into US ships and use them as missiles. Because I know that today we have missiles that, we can kind of put into wherever we want. But back then they didn't. And a lot of the time, the rockets being launched would go off course and bombs being dropped. Those planes, those bombing planes, right? Not the dogfighting planes, but the big ones, they were slow. So they were easy to hit, and they would just drop, and would just hit what was below them. They didn't have accuracy. But if you have a plane, you can fly it right into a ship, right? And die. In doing so, these people were called kamikaze fighters. So what happened on September 11th was not the first time the plane was used as a weapon of war. More Japanese women worked during the war industry, worked during the war, but not in the war industry. They took other jobs, but not making weapons. And the Japanese brought in Korean and Chinese laborers to build war materials. So really, I mean, what's the end of the day here is that all these countries, the people were asked to sacrifice hugely to help win this war. And that's was just part of what it meant. be alive in these countries during World War II. You were asked to sacrifice greatly, and many did.